The rain came down in long diagonal sheets that afternoon, turning the gravel lot outside Dawson's Mechanical into a shallow river of mud and motor oil. Rick Dawson stood in the open bay door with a rag in his hand, watching the convoy of black vehicles slow to a crawl at the edge of his property. 3 flatbed trucks, each one loaded with something massive beneath a canvas tarp, rolled in one after another, and behind them, a silver SUV that still had the showroom gleam on its hood despite the weather. He had seen expensive cars come through this part of the county, before usually they were lost. Usually, they turned around. These ones did not. Rick stayed where he was, wiping the same spot on his palm he had already wiped 3 times, because something about that convoy felt wrong in a way he could not yet put into words. The woman who stepped out of the silver SUV did not look at the rain. She did not look at the mud collecting around the heels of her shoes. She looked at a tablet she was holding, then at the building in front of her. And her expression did not change in the way most people's expressions change when they see a small-town garage for the first time. She had already decided what she was looking at before she arrived. Her name was Victoria Kane. Though Rick did not know that yet, and she ran one of the fastest-growing energy companies in the state, with the kind of quiet, relentless precision that made investors comfortable and employees nervous. She was 44 years old, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse that had somehow survived the weather, and she carried herself the way people do when they have spent years in rooms where every word costs money. She handed the tablet to the man beside her without looking at him and walked toward Rick. Rick Dawson had turned 47 the previous spring, and he had celebrated the occasion alone with a cup of coffee and a carburetor he had been meaning to rebuild for 2 weeks. His daughter, Maya, had called from her college dorm to sing him an off-key version of the birthday song, and that had been the best part of the day by a wide margin. He lived in a house about a quarter mile from the shop, a wood frame place with a porch that needed restaining and a kitchen that smelled permanently of the mechanic's soap he used to scrub his hands. He was not unhappy. He was not the kind of man who spent much time cataloging his emotional state. He had work to do, and work had always been enough. The garage had been open for 11 years. He had bought it from a retiring farmer who had used the space to store equipment, gutted the interior down to the concrete slab, and rebuilt it into something functional, if not exactly beautiful. The sign out front said Dawson's Mechanical, in letters that had faded from dark green to a soft sage color, and local people knew that if you brought Rick Dawson something broken, he would fix it. He did not turn down difficult jobs. He did not pretend a problem was simpler than it was. He charged fair prices, and he stood behind his work. And in a county where the nearest dealership was 40 minutes away, that reputation meant something. What most people in the area did not know, because Rick had never seen the point in telling them, was that he had not always been a garage mechanic. He had spent 14 years as a mechanical engineer working on propulsion systems, the kind of work that happens in buildings with security checkpoints and employee badges that unlock specific doors and not others. He had contributed to projects that did not appear in any public record, projects where the engineering challenges were extraordinary, and the stakes were described in terms most people never encounter in civilian life. He had left that world not because he failed at it, not because he was pushed out, but because of a single year that rearranged his sense of what mattered. His wife, Caroline, had been diagnosed in January and gone by October. And when the autumn ended, Rick looked at his work and his commute and the long hours and the daughter who needed a parent who was actually present. And he walked away. He moved to a smaller county, bought a struggling garage, and rebuilt his life around being there. He never talked about the previous career. It did not come up. When neighbors asked what he had done before, he said engineering. And they nodded and assumed he meant the kind of engineering that involves service trucks and equipment manuals, and he let them assume it. He was not performing humility. He simply did not feel the need to prove anything to anyone. He had chosen this life with both eyes open, and he was satisfied with the choice. He was, by anyone's reasonable measure, the most technically capable person within 100 miles, working in a building that gave no outward indication of that fact. This did not bother him. He had learned, over years, that the people who most needed to announce their own value were usually the ones with the least of it to offer. Rick Dawson fixed things. That was enough. The neighbors closest to him, the dairy farmer to the north, the retired school teacher who brought him her lawnmower every spring, the county road crew that had learned his number by heart, knew him as steady, quiet, fair. They knew he woke early and worked late and kept a shop that was cleaner than most people's kitchens. They knew he could look at a broken piece of equipment and tell you within 10 minutes what was wrong with it, and within an hour what it would take to make it right. They did not know about the 14 years before the garage, and Rick never volunteered the information, not because he was ashamed of it, but because the past was where it belonged, and the present required his full attention. Maya had heard the stories, fragments of them, a father who had worked on things he could not name, in places he could not describe, with people whose professional identities were kept as carefully as state secrets. She had grown up understanding that some work happens in the visible world, and some happens in the dark, and that the second kind is not lesser for being unseen. She had inherited something of his quietness, his comfort with complexity, his preference for substance over announcement. When she had chosen to study materials engineering at university, Rick had made no comment about whether that was inspired by anything in particular. He had simply paid the tuition and asked how her professors were. He did not need her to carry his story forward. He needed her to build her own. The man who approached Rick first was not Victoria Kane. He was a logistics manager named Gerald, broad-shouldered in a company windbreaker, holding a clipboard with the slightly aggressive efficiency of someone who delivers bad news for a living. He explained, briskly, that Kane Dynamics was liquidating certain physical assets as part of a restructuring initiative, and that a purchase order had been arranged for Rick's property to receive 3 industrial prototype units. Rick asked what kind of prototype units. Gerald said they were engine assemblies, experimental, part of a research program that had been discontinued, and the company was disposing of them at salvage value. He named a figure. It was not an impressive figure, but Rick had learned not to judge the value of a job by the number attached to it at the start. He looked at the tarps on the flatbeds. He looked at Gerald's clipboard. He said he would need to see what he was agreeing to take on before he signed anything. Gerald looked mildly inconvenienced. He turned back toward the SUV, and Victoria Kane walked over. She glanced at Rick the way you glance at a piece of furniture you are deciding whether to keep briefly, functionally, without particular interest. She said that the units were non-operational prototypes from a discontinued research program, that the company had no further use for them, that the cost of continued storage outweighed any residual value, and that the paperwork was straightforward. She used the word straightforward, the way executives sometimes do, meaning that she expected the other party not to complicate things. Rick looked at her. He looked at the tarps again. He said, slowly, that he appreciated the explanation, and that he was happy to take a look at the units before they were unloaded, and that he would make a decision after. Victoria blinked once, as though the concept of someone not immediately agreeing with her was a minor glitch she needed to process. Then she nodded at Gerald, who nodded at the truck drivers, and the first tarp came down. Rick looked at what was underneath for a long time without saying anything. The casing alone was different from anything he had seen in a commercial context. The tolerances were extraordinary. The alloy surfaces had a specific finish that he recognized not from garage work but from a much earlier chapter of his life. He kept his face neutral. He said he would take them. Victoria signed the transfer documents. As she turned to leave, she said, without particular cruelty, just as a statement of fact as she understood it, "Do whatever you want with them. They're scrap." She walked back to the SUV. Rick watched the convoy pull out of his lot. Standing slightly apart from the other employees, lingering near the last truck, was a man in his 50s with the build of someone who had spent decades bent over equipment. He had a look on his face that Rick had seen before, the look of a person watching something precious being handled carelessly, the look of someone who knows the real story and is not being permitted to tell it. The man caught Rick's eye for just a moment before he climbed into the vehicle. It lasted 2 seconds, but Rick filed it away. In his experience, the most important information in any technical situation was the thing the official paperwork didn't mention. He began with the first engine the following morning, before the dew had burned off the gravel outside. He laid out his tools in the order he preferred, set up his work lights, and started at the exterior casing, moving inward with the methodical patience that had defined his approach to technical problems for the better part of 3 decades. What he found in the first 2 hours of work rewired his understanding of what he was looking at. The machining on the internal components was not commercial grade. It was not even advanced commercial grade. It was a category above what he had encountered in most of the government-adjacent work he had done in his previous career. The tolerances on the main assembly were tighter than anything he had seen produced outside of classified applications. The alloy composition was unusual enough that he spent an hour just examining the physical properties of the material, running his hands along surfaces and testing flexibility and thermal response with the kind of tactile intelligence that comes from years of hands-on work. He took notes in the small spiral notebook he kept in his shirt pocket, the same type he had used since engineering school, not because he needed to, his memory being what it was, but because the act of writing helped him think. The second engine yielded something he had not expected. Deep in the secondary housing, in a recess that would have been invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it, he found a cluster of stamped markings. The symbols were small, partly worn, the kind of identification coding that gets applied to components in controlled manufacturing environments. Rick crouched over them with his flashlight and went very still. He had seen those particular symbols before, not in a trade catalog, not in a technical manual available to the general public. He had seen them in a context that he was not, strictly speaking, supposed to remember, a context that had been subject to non-disclosure agreements that technically were still in force. He sat back on his heels. The rain was tapping lightly on the roof of the garage. From somewhere outside, a tractor was working a distant field. Rick Dawson stared at the marking and understood, with the slow certainty of a man who has learned to trust his own technical instincts completely, that what he was holding was not scrap. He did not know the full picture yet, but he knew the picture was much larger than anyone had told him. He closed his notebook. He went inside and made a phone call. The man he called was named Douglas Hart, 62 years old, retired to a farmhouse outside of Raleigh, where he kept bees and consulted intermittently for companies that needed someone with a specific and rare kind of knowledge. Rick and Douglas had worked together for 3 years on a project that neither of them discussed in any setting that included other people. They had not spoken in 5 years. When Rick described what he had found, the casing, the alloys, the specific configuration, and then the markings, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Douglas asked him to repeat the last part. Rick repeated it. Another silence. Then Douglas said, with the careful understatement of a man choosing his words very precisely, "Rick, I need you to make sure those are secured." Rick asked him what he was looking at. Douglas said he needed a day to confirm a few things and would call back. He called back in 6 hours. What Douglas told him, speaking in the clipped, compressed language of two people who had spent years communicating technical information without using the terms that would trigger concern in a monitored environment, was this: the engines Rick was sitting on were not failed prototypes. They were the final surviving physical iterations of a research program that had been, according to all official records, canceled and dismantled years earlier. The program had been working on propulsion and energy conversion technology that, if successfully completed, would have represented a generational leap forward, not an incremental improvement, but the kind of foundational breakthrough that restructures an entire industry. The project had been defunded under circumstances that Douglas described as complicated, which Rick understood to mean political and financial in roughly equal measure, and the official narrative had been that all prototype assets were destroyed or rendered inoperable. Clearly, that narrative was incomplete. 3 of the prototypes had survived, and they had just been unloaded onto a gravel lot outside a one-bay garage in rural North Carolina because a CEO had classified them as excess inventory. Douglas said, almost to himself, near the end of the conversation, "Rick, the technology inside those casings is still ahead of everything else in the field. If someone were to complete the work, even partially..." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. What Douglas did not say directly, but what hung in the air between them, in the silence after that unfinished sentence, was the human dimension of what had happened to the project. The researchers who had built these engines, men and women who had spent years of their professional lives on a program that was then declared to not exist, had carried the weight of that erasure forward into their subsequent careers. Some had left the field entirely. Some had continued working in adjacent areas, carrying knowledge that officially had no origin. Douglas knew several of them personally. He had stayed in contact, the way people stay in contact when they have shared something significant that they cannot publicly acknowledge. When Rick asked whether any of those people were still accessible, Douglas said yes, most of them. When Rick asked whether they would want to know what he had found, Douglas paused for a long time, and then said, "I think it would matter to them more than you can imagine." Rick sat with that. He thought about the engineer on the truck. The face that had said everything the words were not permitted to say. He thought about what it would mean to spend the best years of your working life on something real, something important, something that functioned brilliantly in the physical world, and then be told that it had been disposed of, classified as waste, handed away as scrap. He thought about the specific pain of invisibility, not the ordinary kind of being overlooked, but the deliberate kind, the kind that is imposed from above by people who are moving too fast to notice what they are discarding. He closed his notebook and looked at the 3 engines on his bench, and he made a decision that had nothing to do with their monetary value. Rick sat in his shop after the call ended and watched the last of the afternoon light move across the concrete floor. He understood the weight of what he was holding. He also understood, now completely, why the engineer on that truck had looked the way he looked. 3 months after the engines arrived at Dawson's Mechanical, a private equity firm called Meridian Capital began the formal process of acquiring a significant stake in Kane Dynamics. It was the kind of transaction that happens above the visible surface of business news, a confidential process known only to a small circle of advisors, attorneys, and executives. The deal was worth roughly $900 million in total enterprise value, and Meridian was thorough in the way that firms spending that kind of money tend to be. They brought in an external audit team, and the audit team began the unglamorous work of reconciling every asset on Kane Dynamics' books against physical reality. Most of this work was tedious. Some of it was not. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th week of the audit, a specialist named Patricia Huang, who had a background in advanced manufacturing and had been hired specifically because she understood technical assets in ways that most financial auditors did not, flagged an anomaly in the fixed asset register. 3 items had been written off the books at salvage value. The description was vague. The original classification, buried in an archived R&D file, described them differently. Significantly differently. Patricia brought it to her supervisor. Her supervisor brought it to the lead partner. By the following morning, the information had reached Kane Dynamics' CFO. And by noon, it had reached Victoria Kane. The next 48 hours in the Kane Dynamics executive suite were, by all accounts of those who were present, the most unpleasant the company had experienced in its 8-year history. The head of the research division, a careful man named Martin Ellison, who had joined the company only 14 months earlier, spent most of those hours in a conference room explaining to attorneys and board members the technical significance of what the audit had uncovered. He used slides. He used diagrams. He spoke slowly and clearly for people who needed to understand not just that a mistake had been made, but the full magnitude of what the mistake meant. The prototypes were not simply valuable components. They were irreplaceable. The manufacturing processes that had produced certain internal elements had not been documented completely before the project was defunded, and the personnel who had done that work were scattered. Reconstructing the prototypes from scratch would take years and hundreds of millions of dollars, and even then there were aspects of the original work that might not be recoverable. The prototypes were, Martin said, looking around the room at faces that were becoming progressively grayer, the entire foundation upon which any future development of this technology could be built. Without them, the IP portfolio supporting the Meridian deal was worth a fraction of its stated value. The board members asked how this had happened. Martin said, quietly, that the written-off assets had been transferred to a third party as salvage. Someone asked who the third party was. A name was located. It was a one-bay garage in rural North Carolina. Someone else in the room said the word that everyone else was thinking, and the room was very quiet after that. Victoria Kane had built her career on the belief that decisive action was almost always preferable to deliberation, and that the discomfort of a mistake was best addressed by moving through it quickly rather than sitting with it. She had been wrong before, and had corrected course before, and had emerged from those corrections stronger. But she had not been wrong in a way that threatened to cost $900 million and her position before. She called the head of legal. She called the head of operations. She told them to find Rick Dawson and assess the situation. She said to offer a reasonable figure to recover the assets. She assumed the situation would be resolved within the week. Two men in collared shirts arrived at Dawson's Mechanical on a Thursday morning. They were polite in the careful, practiced way of corporate representatives who have been briefed extensively on not saying the wrong thing. They asked for Rick Dawson. He came out from under a tractor he had been working on, wiped his hands, and listened to what they had to say. They explained that Kane Dynamics had become aware of an administrative error in the handling of certain assets that had been transferred to his property, and that the company was interested in repurchasing those items at a fair market value. They named a figure. It was $50,000. Rick looked at them. He said he appreciated them coming out. He said he would think about it and be in touch. They asked when. He said when he was ready. They left. Rick went back to the tractor. He was not playing a game. He was not enjoying the reversal of fortune in any petty way. He was thinking, as he worked, about what he actually wanted out of the situation, not what he could extract, but what the right outcome looked like. He had spent the previous months doing something that had nothing to do with leverage or negotiation. He had been working on the engines, carefully, methodically. In the hours between his regular jobs, he had been examining, cleaning, calibrating, and in certain areas where the years in the transport had caused minor degradation, restoring the internal components. He had not attempted to complete the developmental work. He was not trying to appropriate the technology or claim it as his own. He was doing what he always did with broken things. He was trying to understand them fully. And in understanding them, he was instinctively improving their condition. The first engine had responded in a way that startled him during an initial diagnostic sequence he had rigged up on a Friday night. The output readings were beyond what the original design specifications apparently anticipated. He had shut it down, written 7 pages of notes, and not slept much that night. Whatever was inside these engines, it was not merely valuable. It was extraordinary, and he was not going to hand it back to a company that had thrown it away without first understanding why. When the company's representatives came back a second time with the offer of $200,000, Rick had listened politely, set down his coffee, and declined with the same neutral courtesy he brought to every transaction he did not intend to complete. He understood what was happening on the other side of the table. He understood that Kane Dynamics was not offering him $200,000 because they believed that was the fair value. They were offering it because they believed that was the number at which someone like him, a small-town mechanic, a salvage buyer, would become overwhelmed by the figure and sign. They were operating on an assumption about who he was. The same assumption Victoria had operated on when she called the engines scrap. Rick did not correct the assumption directly. He simply declined and let the next number come. What the company did not understand, and what took them several rounds of escalating offers to begin to suspect, was that the man on the other side of this transaction was not making decisions based on what sounded like a lot of money to a garage owner. He was making decisions based on a technical assessment of what was actually in his shop, a professional understanding of what the technology represented, and a set of values that had nothing to do with the asking price. The company called back 2 days later. They offered $200,000. Rick declined. They offered $400,000. He declined again. A week later, a senior vice president called personally. He said the company was prepared to offer $1 million for the return of all 3 units, and that this was a generous figure for salvage classified assets that had been legitimately transferred. Rick said, with the same even tone he used for all business conversations, that the value of the assets had changed since the transfer, and that money was not his primary concern in this situation. The senior vice president asked what his primary concern was. Rick said he would prefer to discuss that with Victoria Kane directly. The line was quiet for a moment. Then the vice president said he would pass that along. In the 2 weeks between that phone call and Victoria's arrival at the garage, she had done something she rarely did in business situations. She had researched the other party, not through intermediaries, not through a brief summary prepared by an assistant, but herself, personally, in the evenings at her kitchen table, reading whatever she could find. There was not much publicly available. Rick Dawson's name appeared in a few county business registration documents, a local newspaper mention from a charity fundraiser 6 years ago, and a brief reference in a published engineering symposium from 15 years prior, not as a presenter, but in the acknowledgments section of a paper on advanced propulsion dynamics, thanked for technical consultation. She looked at that line for a long time. She ran his name through the professional databases available to her. What came back, partially, because some of it was still under access restrictions she did not have clearance to lift, was enough to substantially revise her understanding of who she had handed those engines to. Several patents, filed under his name, in technical domains that required a level of theoretical grounding not common outside of research institutions. A professional history that ended abruptly, and then, 11 years ago, reappeared as the registration of a small garage in a rural county. She read the gap between those two data points and understood what it meant. She thought about the rainy afternoon when she had stood in his gravel lot and said, "Do whatever you want with them." She thought about it for longer than she was comfortable with. In the meantime, at Dawson's Mechanical, Rick had run a controlled test of the restored first engine. He had rigged a basic measurement setup using equipment he had modified himself. A process that took 3 days and required a level of creative engineering that he had not engaged since his previous career. When the engine ran, it ran cleanly, with an efficiency profile that the original design documents which Douglas had managed to locate through channels Rick preferred not to ask too much about had projected as a best-case outcome, but had never actually achieved. What Rick had done in his quiet restoration work, working at night after Maya called and the shop was empty, was remove years of degradation and missed storage damage, and allow the original engineering to function as it was designed to function. He had not improved the technology. He had simply allowed it to be itself. But the result was extraordinary. 2 of Douglas's former colleagues, engineers Rick had never met, drove down from the research triangle to look at the readings. One of them sat in Rick's office chair for 20 minutes without saying anything after reviewing the data. The other one said, quietly, that this was the cleanest demonstration of the underlying principle he had ever seen in physical hardware. Rick offered them both coffee. They accepted. Nobody said anything dramatic. They did not need to. The numbers said everything. When the external appraiser hired by Meridian Capital was finally given access to the technical assessment data, not the engines themselves, but the engineering documentation and test data that Rick had allowed to be shared through proper channels, the appraiser produced a revised valuation. The 3 engines, as functional, restored prototypes of the only surviving iteration of this technology, were assessed at a combined value of $6.2 million. This figure landed in the Kane Dynamics boardroom, the same week that Victoria Kane was driving to Rick Dawson's garage alone. Without lawyers, without security, without any of the apparatus that normally accompanied her movements in a professional context. She drove herself in an ordinary rental car, because something in her understood that arriving in a convoy was no longer appropriate. Rick heard the car pull up while he was at the workbench. He did not go to the door immediately. He finished what he was doing, set down his tools, wiped his hands, and walked out to the lot. Victoria Kane was standing by her car in jeans and a jacket, not the power blazer of her first visit, looking at the building with a different expression than she had worn the last time. She looked, Rick thought, like a person who had been carrying something heavy and was not sure where to set it down. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." They stood in the lot for a moment. And then Rick nodded toward the open bay, and she followed him inside. She looked at the engines for a long time. They were on the workbench now, partially assembled, clean and precisely arranged in the way that Rick arranged everything he worked on. She could see, even without technical knowledge, that they had been treated with care, that whoever had been working on them had done so with respect, not extraction. She turned to face Rick, and she said, without preamble, without the layer of managed corporate language she had spent years perfecting, "I owe you an apology." Rick waited. She said that she had come to his property and treated him like a disposal site. She said she had made a significant decision about assets she did not understand, and that her assumption about who he was and what he was capable of had been wrong from the first moment. She said the word wrong the way people say it when they mean it completely, not as a tactical concession but as a genuine acknowledgement. She said she had spent her career believing she was a good judge of people and situations, and that standing in his garage, she was no longer sure that was true. She stopped talking. The shop was quiet except for the ambient sound of wind outside. Rick looked at her for a moment. He thought about the engineer on the truck. The man who had looked back at him with that expression, the one who had clearly cared about what was being handed away. He thought about the work he had done on these engines in the evenings, not for money, not as leverage, but because the engineering was extraordinary, and it deserved to be treated as such. He thought about what Douglas had said about the people who had originally built these things, researchers who had spent years on work that was defunded and buried, and officially declared to not exist. He said, "There are people who deserve more than an apology from me. I want them included in whatever comes next." Victoria asked him what he meant. He told her. She listened carefully, in the way of someone who has decided to actually hear what is being said, rather than formulate a response while the other person is still talking. When he finished, she said that she could agree to that. She said she could do more than agree to it, that she wanted to. Rick looked at her and decided she meant it. The terms of the final agreement were not complicated, though they were unusual. Victoria Kane returned to her attorneys with a set of conditions she had worked out in a gravel-floored garage with a man who charged fair prices and did not overstate his requirements. Rick would transfer the 3 engines back to Kane Dynamics. In return, the company would formally credit him, in all documentation and future publications, for the restoration work that had brought the prototypes to operational condition. More significantly, the engineers who had originally worked on the project, several of whom had left the industry believing their work was erased, believing the years they had invested in the technology simply did not count, would be contacted and offered the opportunity to return as credited contributors to the program's next phase. The company would commit to a development timeline that was transparent, documented, and subject to independent technical oversight. These were not conditions about money. They were conditions about what happens to work and to the people who do it, about whether things built with genuine skill and genuine care are acknowledged or discarded. Rick had not designed these conditions to punish anyone. He had designed them to correct an imbalance that had nothing to do with dollars. The $6 million figure was arrived at separately by the independent appraiser and the Meridian Capital team, and it was the company's business, not Rick's demand. What Rick had asked for, and received, was something the accountants did not have a column for. The transfer was completed on a Wednesday morning. Gerald, the logistics manager from the first visit, supervised the loading. He moved through the work with a kind of visible relief. The relief of someone who has been living with the weight of a significant mistake and is now watching it be corrected. Rick watched from the bay door. Before the last truck pulled out, one of the engineers, a woman who had driven down from Charlotte, one of the original research team members who had been contacted as per the agreement, walked over to Rick and shook his hand. She said she had been told what he had done with the engines, the care he had taken, the test results he had produced. She said that she and the rest of the original team had believed the work was gone. Rick said it was not gone. He said, "Good engineering does not go away. It just waits for someone to pay attention to it." She looked at him for a moment and then nodded, and he could see that this meant something to her that he would not have been able to fully articulate and did not try to. The months that followed moved the way consequential things often move, not dramatically, but steadily and with lasting effect. Kane Dynamics' restructured development program was announced quietly, described in industry publications as a renewed initiative in advanced energy conversion technology. The original research team, or most of them, reassembled. The work resumed. The Meridian Capital deal closed successfully at a valuation that reflected the restored prototype assets and the reconstituted research program. Patricia Huang, the auditor who had originally flagged the discrepancy, was offered a full-time position with the company, which she declined, as she preferred the variety of her consulting practice. Douglas Hart, from his farmhouse outside Raleigh, followed the developments with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific kind of news. He called Rick occasionally, and they talked, not about any of this, but about other things, tractors, beekeeping, the specific challenges of maintaining a property in clay soil. The conversations were comfortable in the way of two people who have known each other long enough to not need to explain context. Victoria Kane did not become a different person. She was still decisive. She was still precise. Her staff still found her exacting in ways that occasionally made long meetings uncomfortable. But something had shifted in the way she moved through decisions that involved people she did not immediately recognize as her equals. She had been wrong in a way that cost enormously, not just financially, not just reputationally, but in a way that had nearly erased years of other people's genuine work. That kind of wrong stays with you. It becomes a calibration point. It does not announce itself every day. But it is always present in the room, when the next consequential decision is being made. A quiet voice that asks whether you have looked carefully enough, whether you have asked the question that would reveal what you are actually dealing with, rather than what you assume you are dealing with. She thought about Rick Dawson's garage more than she expected to in the months that followed. She thought about the moment she had signed those transfer documents without reading them carefully, without asking the basic questions, without looking at the engineer's face and wondering what that expression meant. She had been moving fast, the way she always moved. And fast had looked like efficient until it looked like catastrophic. The gap between those two things, efficiency and catastrophe, had turned out to be smaller than she had believed, and the gap was a person she had looked at and categorized and dismissed in the time it takes to cross a gravel lot. She started reading more carefully after that. She started asking questions whose answers she did not already expect to know. She started, in the small, deliberate ways of someone who has been genuinely changed by a real mistake, looking at people as if they might contain more than was visible. Her staff noticed the change, though most of them did not know what had caused it. Some improvements come from success. Some of the deepest ones come from the specific humiliation of having underestimated someone who deserved better, and from being given the rare chance to do right by them afterward. Rick Dawson went back to work. Not metaphorically, literally. The Monday after the transfer, he was in the bay at 7 in the morning working on a grain elevator gearbox that a farmer had dropped off the previous week. The work was unglamorous, and it paid modestly, and it required his full attention. And he gave it his full attention, because that was the kind of craftsman he was. Maya called that evening and asked him if he had really turned down $3 million before the final agreement. He said he hadn't exactly turned it down. The situation was more complicated than that. She said her friends thought he was either very smart or very crazy, and she wanted to know which. He laughed. He said probably some of both. She told him she was proud of him. He said he was proud of her too. After they hung up, he sat on the porch in the cooling evening air and looked at the gravel lot where the convoy had pulled in on a rainy afternoon 6 months before. And he thought about the engineer's face and the markings on the second engine and the way the first engine had sounded when it finally ran clean. He thought about the woman who had stood in his lot and said, "Do whatever you want with them." And the look on her face months later when she said the word wrong and meant it. He thought about Douglas's voice on the phone saying, "Make sure those are secured," and the auditor who had caught the discrepancy, and the engineer from Charlotte who had shaken his hand and not said everything she was feeling, but said enough. He thought about how many of these things would never appear in any press release or any official account of the transaction. He thought that this was fine. Most of the real story of anything important is invisible. A journalist from a regional business publication came by the shop about 2 months after the transfer, working on a piece about Kane Dynamics' renewed research initiative. She had done enough digging to know that a small garage in rural North Carolina was somehow connected to the story, though she did not know the full extent of it. She sat across from Rick in his office, a small room with a metal desk and a whiteboard still half covered in calculations from the diagnostic work he had done on the engines, and she asked him questions. He answered some of them and declined to answer others, politely. The office smelled like coffee and machine oil and pencil shavings, the accumulated scent of 11 years of serious work done in a small space. On the corner of the desk there was a framed photograph of Maya at her university orientation, grinning in the sunlight, and beside it a small spiral notebook of the kind Rick had used since engineering school. The journalist noticed these things the way a good journalist notices everything, recording them without writing them down. Near the end of the interview, she asked a question that she had clearly been saving. She said, "The final valuation on the engines was over $6 million. You were offered significantly less than that at various points. Do you have any regrets about how you handled the negotiation? Is there anything you would have done differently?" Rick looked at his hands. They were clean for the interview, but the skin still carried the permanent faint staining that comes from years of working with oil and metal, a coloring that no amount of scrubbing quite removes, the physical record of a working life, written in the grain of the skin. He thought about the question for a moment, not performing the pause but genuinely using it. The way he used every moment that actually required thought. Then he said, "There are things that are worth more than what they cost." The engines were worth more than the first offer. But that wasn't really the point. The point was that the work those engineers did deserved to be seen, and people in general deserve to be looked at for what they actually are, not for what category they appear to fit into. He paused again. I had a good outcome. But more than that, I think the people who built those engines had a good outcome. That's the part I care about. The journalist wrote down what he said. Then she looked up and said, more quietly, off the record, "Did you know from the beginning how valuable they were?" Rick smiled, and it was the small, private kind of smile that belongs to someone who has been carrying accurate information patiently for a long time. He said, "I knew they were worth something more than what I was told." That's usually enough to know. She thanked him. He walked her out to her car. He went back into the bay. The tractor he had been working on when she arrived was still there, waiting. Patient as all machines are patient, requiring only the right attention to be made whole. The real story is always simpler than the dramatic version, and more complicated than the simple version. A man worked hard and knew his field, and did not allow himself to be diminished by someone else's failure to look carefully. A company made a costly mistake and was given the opportunity to correct it. Some knowledge that deserved to survive survived. Some people who had been told their work did not matter were told, eventually, that it did. None of this required a hero or a villain, though from a distance it could look like a story that had both. Up close, it was what most real stories are, a series of choices made by people doing their best with what they could see at the time, and the long, uneven, often invisible work of setting things right when the vision improves. There is a specific kind of dignity that belongs to people who do good work quietly, who carry significant ability without requiring it to be acknowledged, who absorb the diminishments of a world that judges quickly by surface and go on doing what they do regardless. It is not the flashy dignity of a public vindication or a dramatic reversal. It is quieter and more durable than that. It is the dignity of a man who looks at a broken thing and believes, without needing anyone to confirm it, that it deserves care. Rick Dawson had been living inside that dignity for 11 years before anyone outside a small county knew his name, and he would go on living inside it after the business publications moved on to other stories, after the Kane Dynamics press releases were archived, after the deal closed and the research resumed, and the machinery of corporate life rolled forward. The engines would be studied by engineers, who would take what they found and push the work further, and somewhere in the acknowledgement sections of those future papers, a name would appear, Dawson R., attached to the restoration work. Quiet and permanent, the way real credit tends to be. Not loud, not temporary, just true. Rick Dawson did not put a sign in his window about the $6 million deal. He did not frame a news article. He did not change the name of the shop, or hire more staff, or move to a larger building. The sage-colored letters on the sign out front continued to fade, incrementally, through the following seasons. People continued to bring him things that were broken, and he continued to fix them with the same patient attention he had always brought, the same willingness to sit with a problem until it yielded, the same refusal to pretend something was simpler than it was. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly where he wanted to be in a bay full of honest work, in a county that needed what he offered, doing the thing he was exceptionally good at, in a building that gave no outward indication of what it contained. The real value of a person, Rick had long believed, is not visible to someone moving fast. It requires stillness. It requires the willingness to look at what is actually in front of you, rather than the category you have already prepared for it. Some people go a whole career without learning that. Some learn it the hard way. In a gravel lot in the rain, handing away something irreplaceable to someone they thought was beneath them. And some people, the quiet ones, the ones with oil-stained hands and notebooks full of calculations that no one has asked to see, have known it all along, which was, as it had always been, the point.